Hello and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today, no matter what it is that you're doing. If you've not joined me before, my name is Gem. I work primarily with wire and gemstones and I'm based in the United Kingdom. For our free wire tutorial today, I'm going to show you a couple of variations on the same basic theme, things you can do with side drilled flat pear drop beads. So if you'd like to join me down at the board, I'll show you the designs that we're going to work up together today. So our first design today is going to be using the wire crinkler tool, and it's going to be this little drop shape. So it's small enough to be earrings because I'm using some 14mm pear drops, but it's also large enough to be a really pretty little pendant, especially if you make it in something with a pop of colour like these turquoise coloured magnesite beads, which I've had in my stock since the dawn of actual time. So we're going to be using 3 different wires today. I have some 1mm or 18 gauge, I have some 0.8 or 20 gauge, and this is going to go through the wire crinkler to turn into this, which is obviously quite a different look, very easy to work with the tool. We're also going to be working with some 0.4 or 26 gauge, which you see here holding both parts of the designs together and also setting the main focal bead. So this is the one we're going to do first. So let me just pop the other one out of the way for the time being. If you've never worked with wire before, one of the best things that you can do before you get cracking is to warm and smooth your wire. So just gripping very firmly on one end of this 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and this is an overly long length. You probably only need about 9 inches or so. This is about 11, so you'll see how much we cut away in a moment. What we're going to do is have a quick look at the bead that we want to set. So this is side drilled, meaning it goes from one side to the other. Front drilled and top drilled are different things altogether. So this is side drilled, it goes through. So you'll need to check what wire will be accommodated by the drill hole in your chosen bead. But this is going to sit on some 0.4 or 26 gauge. The first thing that I want to do is to create a nice little pear shape to go around the outside of that bead. So I'm going to use a marker pen. You could, if you wanted to, use something like a ring mandrel, if you have a size that goes small enough, or you could use a multi-step bail maker. So I've just made a very, very basic shape of the U shape in the bottom or the centre of that section of wire, and I'm just going to try it on for size. So what I'm looking for is a little more space than I've created here. So if you don't have a form that's quite right, because we warmed that wire, we can just open that out slightly and manipulate the wire until it fits around that bead. So the next thing that I'm going to do is bring the 2 sides slightly closer together and create an oversized pear that skirts around the outside of the bead. I like to see negative space in jewellery, so that's why there is a gap between the bead and the little frame wire that goes around the outside, so you can see some skin or clothing perhaps underneath the piece when it is completed. Just adds a different element. Sometimes jewellery pieces are absolutely filled to the brim with metal or with gemstones. With this one we're going to use a little bit of negative space. So the next thing that we're going to do is just turn some uprights on one of those ends. So I'm going to grip a hold of which is the wire coming from the right hand side, just up at the top where those 2 wires cross over, and I'm going to turn that into an upright shape. And that's where I'm going to leave that for now. Leaving these 2 sections, these 2 sides untied and with a little gap makes our life slightly easier when it comes to adding the next part of the design. So I'm going to pop this just up to the side for a moment and show you what the wire crinkler tool looks like. This is mine that I've had for about, well, forever by the looks of things. It's been dropped and taken all over the country and all sorts of places that's been. So that's why it looks a little bit worse for wear. It's very elderly, but it still functions, so I keep it. I have a small section here of 0.8 or 20 gauge wire, and I'm going to show you now how the tool will crinkle that wire for you. So if I pop the end of the wire, this is only about 4 or 5 inches or so, I'm just going to capture the end of the wire between the cog faces, and ideally I want to capture that about halfway up the cog face. And I'm just going to press down firmly on both of those wheels, those gears if you prefer, I'm going to turn and turn and turn until I have crinkled the entire section of wire. So looking at the cogs themselves, or the gears if you prefer, when you're aiming the wire through the guide hole, you want to get the tip of the wire around about halfway up the gear itself, and in that way you don't tend to lose purchase and you can create this section of crinkled wire in one fell swoop. So that was 0.8 or 20 gauge approximately wire. I'm working with round raw copper, as is my preference. So the next thing we're going to do is tidy up both ends of this section of crinkled wire. As it happens, this end piece looks like it's actually cut on one of these pieces which is triangular in formation, but I am going to trim that away and show you what I'd like you to do here. So we're looking to trim exactly on the triangle of that form. I like to think of these as mountains and valleys. It's just a little way that I like to think of these because it makes it easier to communicate what bit we're working with. The next thing that we're going to do is check the other end. This is already cut on exactly the right place. So I'm going to bring my frame back into position and we're going to start having a look at using some round nose pliers. And I'll show you how to get a really nice ending onto a section of crinkled wire. So let's pop this over to one side for a second. I'm going to use my round nose pliers to just grab the very end of that wire and turn it around into a loop. And we're only using half, so we're using a slope. So from the mountaintop to the valley, or in this instance we used from the valley up to the mountaintop. So we're only using half of a form to create that loop, and I'm just going to give that a tiny squash between the flat faces of my pliers to make sure that that's nice and strong. What we're going to do now is to start forming this around the form that we want to highlight or add interest to. So what I'm doing here is I'm pushing the crinkled section of wire into the frame wire so that I can get it to copy the shape. If you struggle with this technique, another way that you can do this is to go freehand. So I'm just estimating the size of that pear drop that we've created, and I'm making a series of very small movements to allow the wire to form around the outside of that shape. So you can see where we made that upright angle. We're going to be completing the pear drop shape opposite that. So we need our frame to sit neatly around that pear drop shape, but not higher than the right angle that we made at the top. So I'm just going to manually adjust this until it looks good. I'm quite happy with how that's looking, so what we need to do now is trim away. And you can see where we've got valleys and mountains and valleys. I'm going to trim away here at this particular point, just capturing that excess over to one side. I'm going to flip this over because I'm right dominant and it's easier for me to rotate my pliers that way. So I'm going to put the pliers right at the very tip of that cut section and I'm going to rotate that away. And what we're doing is we're making a circular form with just half of one of those zigzags, half of a crinkle. If that doesn't close up, you can very, very tenderly just give that a bit of a squeeze. And then you've got equal and opposite loops up at the top on both sides. So I'm just going to hold the whole assembly together. I'm quite happy with how that looks in terms of size and shape. And what we're doing is we're creating an interesting, almost a floral or a filigree, something like that, a little bit more interest to go around the outside of our frame wire. So we've got our extra little bit of zigzag. We're going to put that over to one side. What we're going to do before we add the zigzag section is we're going to tie our bead into position. So for this, I'm going to use some 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. I have around about 14 inches for the whole project. So what we're going to do to start off with is just run the tail of the wire over the side where we made that angled bend first. Let me just get the bead out of the way. I'm going to draw it down from that angle and bring that around at least 3 times. So I'm just creating a coil around the side of that frame wire until we have 3 good turns. like so. And then I'm going to trim away that very, very end section inside the frame. So you need to make sure that you're only cutting the excess away and you don't accidentally trim off the long piece that we're trying to work with. So I've got that coil as neat and as tidy as I possibly can. And I'm just going to allow that to sit in position whilst I find the end of my finer gauge wire. Pop the bead on the end of the wire and allow that to zip line down into position. So you may need to just move that up or down dependent on where you would like the bead to sit. That looks about right for me. Like I said, I want to have negative space in this particular design. I think it's quite attractive. So I'm going to flip the design over now, so we're looking at the back. And I'm going to draw the tail around just the long side that we haven't yet angled. So that's once, twice, and then a third time. And we're going to trim away there. So we started with about 14 inches. We've used a very small amount. The reason I like to add the bead on using a long length of wire is it makes your life slightly easier. It's quite thrifty to use up little sections of wire that you have in your scrap pot, and that's absolutely fine, but to show you how that works, it's easier to use a long tail. Also, if you're newer to wire, it's easier to have that slightly longer tail as well. So now we've set our bead into position, what we're going to do is draw the long tail that's going away towards the angled side. We're going to create a right angle over in this direction to the 9 o'clock position, like so. And then I'm going to wrap the long tail around the neck of the design. So I'm just going to keep hold of the angle we've just made and draw the tail of the wire that went across to 9 o'clock all the way around. Now I'm gripping it very, very firmly down here so that we don't lose any of that right hand wire in the coil that we're about to make around this neck section. So I'm just going to give that a little bit of a squeeze to get it to sit where I want it to before pinching very firmly with my non-dominant hand and bringing the wire around a good couple of times to create a neck of the design. Now I've made that slightly messily, so I'm just going to tidy that up and make sure that that meets with my requirements. So just neatening and tidying. I might take that around again. And then potentially we've got excess here now, which we can use to put a coil up at the top if we want to. So that's slightly baggy on the one coil, so I'm just going to tighten that as I say. And we do have a little bit of a tail here to work with. If you wanted to, you could separate these two so that they were side by side and do some basket weave and make a much more interesting bail. I'm just going to leave them as they are for now, and I'll probably put a coil over the face of that little bit just up at the top there. One of the reasons I love to work with raw copper is it is very tolerant. So if you warm it before you start working, if you do make any minor errors, it does give you the opportunity just to get that back into position without having to bin the lot and start again. Also, I just wanted to chat to you very, very briefly about the wires I'm using. So 1mm 18 gauge, 0.8mm which is 20 gauge, and 0.4mm which is 26 gauge. Absolutely my go-to wires. I can use those to make almost anything. With the wire crinkler tool, which I have just here. As I say, this is a very, very old one. It's my old faithful. Really, really useful device. Absolutely fantastic. If you don't have one, I would very much consider investing in one. They're fantastic. And I use them all the time to add basically detail to my designs. It's also quite functional. I've made bangles with them. There's a couple of tutorials on my page that use them to set cabochons, so do have a bit of a scout around. It's a really handy tool to have. If you join me back down at the board, we'll move on to the next stage of our tutorial. So you can see we have now set our side drilled puffy pear drop, or a flat pear drop, whichever way you want to work. Those will both work beautifully with this design. And that in and of itself is pretty. It's quite attractive, but we're going to make it slightly more fancy. So we're going to bring back that section that we worked with earlier, and we're going to add that onto the design. So if you decided that actually that was a little bit too big and it went up too far, I'm going to show you how to edit that slightly now. So if you wanted to make this one section smaller on either side, what you'd need to do is trim away where the valley used to be as we're looking at it right now. So we're taking away the curly section that we made, flip the design over, again at the point which used to be the valley on this section of crinkle. Take away those excess pieces, and what we're going to do is turn these. You've got a slope up and a slope down. We're going to turn, in this instance, the slope down inwards to create a small curl, which we will attach to the frame in just a moment. So just rotating that around gently, and it is just half of the section. So we're looking now at, from this angle, it's going upwards. So let's just work at it from this angle. So we're going to take that half segment, twist that around the very, very tip of your round nose pliers until it sits back and meets the rest of the wire. So the smart thing to do at this stage is to flatten those back down again, give it a bit of a squish, bit of a squeeze, quite gently, and make sure that those loops are as reasonably equal and opposite as they can be. So let me show you what that looks like now. I think that will fit just a little bit better. I think that looks quite pretty. So we're going to add that to the frame now with some of our 0.4mm gauge wire, or 26 gauge. So what we would need to do, let me just clear that out the way, is take the remainder of our finer gauge wire. I'm going to take that little zigzag section out of the way, and I tend to start halfway around the design. So we're going to be adding on from here all the way around that pear shape up to here. So let's start at the base of the design. I'm going to loop my finer gauge wire through, and it's the remainder of our 14 inches, so it's around about 12 inches or so. And I'm going to wrap that once around the frame wire down at the bottom. So post the end through, draw that all the way round, and you've got a nice tight little helix of wire running around that frame. We're then going to add in our zigzag section. So what I need to do, I want to have the zigzag section in the same place as the frame wire. So the finer gauge wire is coming underneath the frame, so I want it to come underneath the zigzag section as well. So we're just going to offer that into position. The finer gauge wire on the left hand side is coming away over the top of the frame, so it needs to go over the top of that zigzag section as well. So what we're going to do is all the way around that frame wire, we're going to alternate between wrapping around just the frame and then one time around the frame and the zigzag section. So if I post the tip of the wire through the gap, again, just support that as it comes through, and you can see what we're doing is we're tying that zigzag section to the frame wire, and then that little section that's just open at the top, you can draw the wire through, because the next circuit that we're going to take is only around the frame. So post the end through again, down it goes all the way through. So we've got a helix around just that frame wire before adding another loop around the frame and the zigzag section. So post the end between the gemstone and the frame, draw that all the way around, making sure that your zigzag section sits side by side with the frame and doesn't try to sit on top. Bring the wire up the gap so that we can circuit once around just the frame, post the end through, draw that into position before, you've guessed it, wrap around the zigzag and the frame. And I'm just going to continue all the way up to the top. Let's zoom through one side. I'll show you the complete process for one side. Draw that all the way around, again making sure that the zigzag sits side by side with the frame. You can bring the tail up through one last time here, post the tail through, draw that through, and then what we need to do is accommodate where we've added the bead when you get to it, which will be slightly different depending on what bead you're using. So in this instance, I'm going to post the tail of the wire just beneath that point where we've added the bead on. Grab hold of the wire that's underneath, pull that tautly into position, and then the next place that I would come up is actually inside the loop of the zigzag section. I'll just put that through a couple of times, you'll see where we're coming up with the wire. Pull that into position, post it back down inside the frame wire again, And then just finish off with 3 wraps just on the frame, and that is really to draw a nice sturdy conclusion to our bit of the magic of wire work, which is tying stuff together on a tiny scale with other wire. Now if you wanted to, you could fill the entire gap leading up to the coil that we made. Depends on what your aesthetic pleasure would be. So I'm just going to do that now. Just finish off with a couple more coils up at the top, as long as you can get the same number of coils on the other side. I think that's 5, and I think that'll be fine. So I'm just going to turn the design over slowly, trim away the end of the wire inside the design, like so, before giving that a very gentle squish and a squeeze to make that sit down neatly. So I flip the design over. All you will do is repeat on the other side. So we're tying the frame to the valley, 1 circuit around just the frame, frame to valley, and then when you get to the tricky bit, just try and get that equal and opposite so that you can see some form of symmetry. So let's give that a squish and a squeeze. And then when I finish this side, we'll reconvene and I'll show you just how to finish off at the top. So I've just whizzed up the left-hand side of the pendant, tying it all together as instructed on the right-hand side, and I'll show you now how to just finish this off as a simple design. So all we're going to do is make a rapid wrapped loop up at the top. Now if you're making a pendant, you will definitely want to have this long tail coming forwards so that you can create a loop onto which you can thread your design as a pendant. So I'm just pushing the wire forwards like so. We're then going to use round nose pliers, or let's grab the bail makers. They are right there. That's literally what they're for. So I'm going to rotate the bail making pliers around until I get a nice round form at the top of the design. Pop that back in, draw that tail around so that it meets. Another really useful tool to grab a hold of. I'm going to support that round form and draw the tail of wire around a couple of times to complete that wrapped loop, which I know I've shown you a couple of times, so I'm just going to whiz on through. Give that a bit of a squeeze to get that neat and tidy. Make sure that's not too twisted. And then when you've finished, you've got a couple of tails of wire to deal with. So what I would think I'm going to do is put a bit of a coil on either side. Just means that if it's earrings and it twists around, it looks pretty from both angles. If you do want to do a coil on both sides, and you might want to, even if it's a pendant, you might want it to be reversible, especially if you've got interesting markings on your stone. Just going to trim those to 2 equal lengths. Slightly less equal than I had anticipated, so let's give that a bit of a tidy up. And then we're going to go for a small coil over the front of the design. Now what I'm going to do here is make the coil come up and away from the design to begin with. So I've started off with the round nose pliers to create that coil shape before pushing that into my non-dominant forefinger, pushing that around and around until we get a reasonably neat coil sitting over the front of that neck section of the design, just a little bit further then. And then what I'm going to do is push that down into position so that it sits neatly over the face. You can then do the exact same thing with the wire that you have remaining on the other side, and you can see that your weaving or your tying together will look as neat on one side as the other. So it truly is dual faceted if you want it to be. And then if you want to, they could be a nice pair of earrings. Obviously, if you are making earrings, you will want to concentrate on that wire symmetry. Obviously this is completely different because this one's got both coils on the face and a much smaller loop than the one I've just shown you now. So if you are making earrings, I do them bit by bit and try and match them up. So for the second mini tutorial based on the same basic principle, I've already done the first part of the same process as we did for the first piece, which was to create that lovely pear drop shape, have a little angle going upwards, and to set the bead into position using 3 wraps on either side with that 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. I'll show you on the board what that looks like. You can always refer back to the beginning of today's video if you need to, but it's the same basic principle. So you can see I've done exactly the same thing again, and this is what we're going to work for this time, or work towards this time. So we've set that bead into position, Again, if you're making earrings, you need to make sure that they're symmetrical and that you're happy with the neatness and where the bead sits in the frame. So I might just tighten that up slightly, like so. And what we're going to do now is a very similar process to just add on some beads around the edge. So I'm using now around about 10 inches or so of that 0.4 or 26 gauge wire. This again is round raw copper, but instead of starting down at the base, I'm going to start at one side. Now normally I would encourage starting in the middle because it makes your life slightly easier, but what happens with when you're wrapping on beads around the edge of something, there's a direction to the weave. So if I show you on this one, you'll see that the beads are coming against the frame wire. They're set against the frame wire rather in a particular fashion. So you've got the wire comes through out at an angle and then naked wire goes back to the frame. The bead is sitting on the wire like so, and then there's a naked section of wire going back to the frame through the bead just by itself. If you start at the bottom, it can be quite difficult to replicate that in different directions. So what we're going to do is start up on one corner or one edge, and I'm going to start by winding on the wire. So you can allow that little pear drop to just drop out of the way for a moment, and we're going to wrap 3 times around that frame wire again. You can utilise your pliers to help you get a good strong coil going if you like. I'm going to go for a little bit of wire wastage here, purely because it's just easier to get a really nice neat finish if you've got a little bit of a tail to work with. So I'm going to trim away that excess. Ideally you want the very end of that wire to sit inside the frame, so I'm just going to rotate that around. I've actually gone for 4 wraps there. How very rude and naughty of me. Rebellious. So I'm just going to rotate that coil of wire around until the very, very end section sits inside that frame wire. And then I'm going to scooch that up as far as I can, dependent on where we've set that side drilled puffy pear. So I'm now going to turn the design upside down because it's easier for me being right dominant. My finer gauge wire is coming underneath the frame wire, so I'm going to bring that wire out to one side, add in the first of my beads, and I'm just going to show you this 1 or 2 times because it's just a very repetitive process. Finer gauge wire coming away underneath that frame wire. I'm going to push this bicone, which is the perfect shape to use in a design like this, against the outside of that frame wire. Because my finer gauge wire has come from underneath, it means it needs to travel through the bead and then over the top of that frame wire and back down between the frame and our focal bead. So allow that to pull all the way through. We're not going to be pulling too tightly because we don't want to uncoil our starting point. Once that's set nicely, you can just add a little bit more tension. And I'm going to replicate those 4 wraps that we started with. Normally I would go for 3, but I accidentally did 4, and I'd quite like to replicate that. So posting the tail of the wire down between the bead and the frame. That's a 3rd wrap. We're just going to tighten those up slightly, being very, very careful of those beads, making sure we're not scratching them or putting them at any risk of damage. So we're going to go for 1 more journey down between the bead, focal bead rather, and the frame wire, pulling that nice and firmly into position and then tidying up those 4 wraps before adding in our subsequent bead. So you can see that we've added on 4 wraps, then a bead, 4 wraps. Get the next bead onto the finer gauge wire. You can tell that this is not something my eyes are very good at. There it is, there's that tricky little hole. Allow that to sit all the way down so that it sits against the frame wire. Support the bead into position, and again the finer gauge wire has come underneath, so it needs to travel up through the bead and then over the top of that frame wire before going back inside the frame. Give that a bit of tension. Every time you add a bead you're getting a little bit more strength. A nice firm angle as the finer gauge wire travels over the top, down and back in the opposite direction before wrapping 4 times again and adding your subsequent bead, and on you go until you have filled the gap. So let's just speed that along a little bit. We'll do one more together and then we will move on. So the tail all the way through. You've got your 4 wraps, so once you've got your 4 wraps, or however many you choose to do, you're going to tighten those coils up like so, before bringing that wire sharply away and adding the subsequent bead. Let's see if we can get this one on a little bit faster, shall we? There we go. Zips down into position, sits against the frame wire like so, support the bead, take the tail through like so. And we're looking to get a nice firm grip now. You can add a bit more tension. And as you get a little bit more deft at it, dependent on how quickly you are able to thread those beads, you can actually crack through a design like this reasonably quickly. It's a very inexpensive way to add some pizzazz to a slightly plainer pendant. You might prefer a slightly more minimal design, but you just continue around, and then when you get to the end you've got exactly the same option as we had with our first tutorial. So you could have 2 coils, you could have no coils, you could go for a coil front and back like I demonstrated for the first tutorial, but it's exactly the same process. So you will go through adding a right angle bend with the wire that crosses over, coiling that around a preset number of times if you're making earrings so you can match them, and finishing off in exactly the same way. So I hope you've enjoyed those little mini tutorials based on the same basic process, just a couple of different ways of adding some interest and detail to a frame around your puffy pear drop bead that's side drilled. Have yourself a beautiful day, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Bye for now.